The sun was setting over the calm lake, casting a warm golden glow across the water as I sat by the window with my cup of tea. The peaceful quiet of the moment was both soothing and unsettling. For so long, I had been surrounded by the bustle of family life, dinner to be made, laundry to fold, phone calls to answer, and children to care for. The rhythm of my days had always been filled with the sounds of other people's needs. But now, with the house growing quieter, I was finally alone with my thoughts. And that's when it hit me, the realization I hadn't allowed myself to see for years. I had spent so much of my life caring for everyone else, but I had forgotten about me. I had always thought that being a mother, being a wife, was my purpose. I thought that by putting my family's needs above my own, I was fulfilling my role in life. I didn't mind it. In fact, I found comfort in it. The little sacrifices here, and there didn't feel like sacrifices at all when I was doing them out of love. But when my husband and I divorced, when my children began their own lives, I found myself standing in the middle of an empty house, questioning everything I had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of them that left me feeling unsettled. It was the realization that for the first time, I didn't have anyone depending on me. For years, I had been needed. My family had relied on me for everything, from emotional support to managing the house. And when that role was suddenly no longer needed in the same way, I found myself lost. Who was I if I wasn't the caretaker? Who was I if I wasn't someone's mother or wife? As I sat there looking out at the lake, a thought began to form in my mind, a thought I had been avoiding for years. I had been living my life for everyone else. I had spent decades ensuring that my family's needs came first, but in doing so, I had neglected my own. I had spent so much time giving to them, so much time trying to be everything they needed, that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. And in that moment, the thought came to me, what if I lived for me? It wasn't that I didn't love my children or my ex-husband. It wasn't that I didn't care about them. But I realized that I had lost sight of who I was outside of my roles as a mother and a wife. I had forgotten what made me happy, what I truly wanted, what I dreamed of for myself. For years, my dreams had been wrapped up in their happiness, their success, their well-being. I had poured all my love and energy into them. And now, I felt like I had nothing left to give. That's when it happened. A simple moment, a quiet realization that changed everything. I smiled to myself, a faint smile that held a hint of sadness, but also something else, a spark of something new. It's time, I thought. Time for me to reclaim my life. Time for me to make decisions that were about me, not about what others expected of me. I wasn't angry, I wasn't resentful, I was just awake. I had been living in the shadows of others for so long, but now I was ready to step into the light of my own life. The smile on my face was one of quiet resolve. It wasn't the smile of someone who had it all figured out. It was the smile of someone who had decided, for the first time in years, to live for herself. And that in itself was a revelation. I had been so busy making sure everyone else was happy, I had forgotten that I deserved happiness too. It wasn't going to be easy, I knew that. The path ahead would be filled with uncertainties. But in that moment, sitting by the window with the lake stretching out before me, I made a decision. It was time for a change. It was time to stop being the person who always gave and started being the person who could finally receive, who could finally take what she deserved. I wasn't sure where the road would lead, but I knew that it had to start with me. And so, as the last of the sunlight faded over the lake, I made a promise to myself. I was going to start living for me. I was going to create a future that I could look forward to, a life where I wasn't just a mother or a caretaker, but someone who had dreams of her own. It was time to take that first step. The decision to change my life wasn't made overnight. It was a slow, almost reluctant shift, a quiet rebellion that started in the depths of my mind. For years, I had lived according to the expectations of others. As a mother, I gave everything. As a wife, I did everything. And somewhere along the way, I forgot about me. Now, sitting in the stillness of my new life, I realized how much I had been waiting for someone else to give me permission to take care of myself. But no one was coming. The only person who could make that choice was me. I had always dreamed of living by the lake, in a peaceful, quiet place where I could escape the noise, the chaos, and the constant demands. somewhere I could reconnect with myself and truly begin to heal. But it had always seemed like a far-off dream, something for later, when I had more time, when the kids were settled, when life was less demanding. But now, I knew that later might never come. Now was the time. And so, I made the decision to stop waiting. I started searching for the perfect place. A villa by the water, somewhere serene, somewhere I could feel the quiet and hear my own thoughts. The idea felt freeing, exhilarating even, but also a little terrifying. After all, I had lived in my family home for so long, surrounded by memories of my children growing up, of our shared history. The thought of leaving it behind felt like an enormous leap, but I also knew that staying wasn't an option anymore. I couldn't go back to that life where I was invisible, giving everything but receiving nothing in return. I remember the first time I drove out to the lake to look at a property. The drive was peaceful, just the sound of the tires on the road and the quiet hum of my thoughts. When I pulled up to the villa, I was struck by its beauty. The large windows facing the lake, the wraparound porch that seemed to invite hours of quiet reflection, and the lush greenery surrounding it. It felt like a dream. Standing on the porch, I could already imagine myself there, sitting with a cup of tea, watching the sun rise over the water, or walking along the shore, breathing in the fresh air. For the first time in a long time, I could see a future that wasn't about anyone else but me. Me. I knew that making this decision wouldn't be easy. I would have to leave behind the house I had shared with my children, the place where I had raised them, built a family. But I realized that I couldn't keep holding on to the past. I had to let go and step into the future, into a life that was entirely mine. It wasn't about abandoning them. It was about reclaiming myself, finding peace and happiness on my own terms. I took a deep breath and walked inside the villa, imagining how I could make it my own, how I could fill it with new memories. And with that, I made the call. I decided to buy the villa. It was mine, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, contracts, and preparations to move. As the reality of my decision sank in, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. There were moments when I questioned myself. Was this the right thing to do? Was I being selfish? But I quickly reminded myself that this wasn't about anyone else. It was about me. And if I couldn't prioritize my own happiness at this stage in my life, then when? When I told my children about the move, their reactions were mixed. My son was the most vocal. "Mom, you should be grateful that we live together. Not everyone your age has that privilege," he said. His words stung, though I didn't show it. I smiled and nodded, but inside, I knew it was time for a change. Grateful? Yes, I was grateful for them. But I was also grateful for myself, for the chance to live my life without sacrificing who I was. I smiled that day, but inside, I knew I was making the right choice. I wasn't walking away from my family. I was stepping into a life where I could be whole again. I wasn't abandoning my children. I was giving myself the space to grow, to heal, to become the woman I had always been beneath all the roles I had played for others. I moved into the villa shortly after. The house, still empty and echoing with potential, became my sanctuary. The solitude that had once seemed daunting was now a gift. I had my own space, my own peace, and it felt like freedom. In those first few days, I woke up early just as the first light of dawn touched the lake, and I realized something. This was my life now, my decision, my future. For the first time in years, I could breathe deeply without guilt, without feeling like I was doing something wrong by living for myself. I wasn't sure what the future would hold. I didn't know exactly how my relationship with my children would evolve, or what new challenges might arise. But I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer living for anyone else's approval or expectations. I was living for me, and that was the most powerful thing I had done in years. The first days in the lakeside villa were a mix of excitement and quiet reflection. It was a space that was completely mine, and I could feel the weight of that every time I walked through the door. The stillness was different than the quiet I had known before. In my old life, the quiet had always been filled with the hum of my thoughts, the undercurrent of things left undone. But in the villa, the quiet felt like peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing after anything. I wasn't rushing to fulfill someone else's needs or checking off a list of responsibilities. I was just here. The house itself was beautiful, but it was empty. When I first walked through the rooms, I knew it would take time for me to fill the space, not just with furniture and decorations, but with my own presence, my own energy. The walls felt bare, but they were filled with possibilities. The garden outside, untouched and wild, needed tending, and that was the first thing I did. I started planting flowers, lavender, daisies, roses. Each plant, each flower was a small act of care, not for anyone else, but for me. The simple joy of digging into the earth, feeling the soil between my fingers, made me realize how long it had been since I had done something, just because it made me happy. No one asked me to plant a garden. I didn't have to explain it to anyone. I just did it. In the evenings, I would sit outside, watching the sunset over the water, feeling the cool breeze against my skin. It was peaceful, but there were moments, too, when the silence would feel too heavy. I would find myself sitting in the living room, staring at the empty walls, wondering what came next. It wasn't loneliness, exactly. It was more the feeling of change, a life that was still taking shape, still finding its rhythm. One afternoon, after a long walk by the lake, I sat down on the porch and picked up my phone. I hadn't spoken to my children much since I moved. I knew they were still adjusting, still processing the fact that I had made such a bold decision. I had tried calling a few times, but I wasn't sure how to bring it up or what to say. Then a text came through from my son. "Mom, I know you wanted your space, but I hope you're okay." I took a deep breath before replying. It wasn't just a simple question. There was an undertone to it, a subtle judgment, as if he was wondering whether I was making the right choice. It hurt, but I didn't let it show. I had made this decision for me, and I couldn't expect everyone else to understand right away. I typed my response, "I'm okay. I'm more than okay. I'm just finding my way again. I needed this space, and I hope you understand that." The response didn't come immediately, and I felt that familiar knot of uncertainty in my chest. But then my phone buzzed. "I do understand, Mom. I just want you to be happy." Those words, "I just want you to be happy," hit me harder than I expected. Because I had spent so many years making everyone else happy, I had almost forgotten how to pursue my own happiness. How could they understand something that I was still learning? But in that moment, I realized that I had to trust myself. I had to trust that this space I had created, this quiet, this freedom, was exactly what I needed to heal and grow. The days turned into weeks, and as the sun began to set a little earlier each evening, I found myself settling into a new routine. The mornings were mine. I would wake up, make coffee, and take a walk by the lake, watching the mist lift from the water. The peace of the mornings, the stillness, became my sanctuary. It was the first time in my life I felt like I wasn't rushing. I wasn't hurrying to be somewhere or be someone for anyone else. I could just be. There were still moments of doubt. I won't lie. There were days when the silence of the villa felt deafening, and I missed my children's laughter and the constant bustle of a family under one roof. But those moments were fleeting and they began to fade. I realized that the silence wasn't a void. It was a space for me to fill with my own thoughts, my own dreams, and my own aspirations. I began to reconnect with parts of myself I had buried under years of service to others. I started painting again, something I hadn't done in years. I took long walks in the woods behind the villa, and I began to journal. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what I might write. The pages didn't have to be filled with the right things. They didn't have to be perfect. They were mine, and they were just for me. It was liberating. One day, after I had spent hours in the garden, I sat back on the porch with a glass of lemonade, feeling the sun on my face. I had spent so much time thinking about what my children would think, what my ex-husband would think, and how everyone would judge me. But now, sitting there, I realized something crucial. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need anyone's approval. I had already given myself the approval I needed. I had given myself permission to live for me. It wasn't a selfish thing. It wasn't about abandoning my family. It was about being whole again. It was about finding balance, peace, and joy that wasn't dependent on anyone else. I had spent so many years focusing on others, but now I was learning to focus on myself. And that felt like the most radical act of self-love I could have ever done. The weeks that followed my move to the lakeside villa were filled with small, quiet moments of discovery. I found myself embracing the change in ways I hadn't expected. At first, the idea of being on my own, of having complete control over my time and my space, felt foreign. I had spent so many years taking care of others that the thought of living solely for myself seemed almost indulgent. But the longer I stayed in this peaceful home by the lake, the more I began to understand the importance of this time for me. I woke up each morning to the gentle sound of birds and the soft rustling of the leaves outside. The first days were still filled with an air of novelty, the newness of the place, the feeling of freedom that came with it. But after a few weeks, I began to realize that this was more than just a new house. This was a new chapter in my life, and with it came a new sense of purpose. I had always defined myself by the roles I played in other people's lives: mother, wife, caretaker. But now, I didn't need to fit into anyone else's expectations. I could simply be. And that was both beautiful and terrifying. I had spent so many years worrying about everyone else's happiness that I had forgotten how to prioritize my own. It was time to learn how to do that again. The villa became a reflection of my inner transformation. I took my time to make it feel like mine. I painted the walls a soft, calming color. I added fresh flowers to every room. I set up a cozy nook by the window where I could sit and read or just think. Every little change in the house mirrored a change in me. Small but significant steps toward reclaiming my own identity. And then there were the walks. Every morning, I would walk by the lake, the cool air filling my lungs, the soft crunch of gravel beneath my feet. There was something about the lake, the calmness of it, the way the water reflected the sky, that made me feel at peace. It was during these walks that I found clarity. My mind, once so busy and filled with obligations, began to clear. I could hear myself think, hear my own voice again. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty about it. I started to reflect on the years I had spent giving so much of myself to my family, to my children, to my ex-husband. I had done it out of love, but I also realized that I had been running on empty. I had never learned how to take care of myself first. Now, I was learning that lesson. It was okay to focus on my own happiness, to embrace the quiet, to embrace the stillness, and to take time for myself without feeling like I was doing something wrong. One evening, after a long day of gardening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. For a brief moment, everything felt perfect. I had created this life for myself. I had made the choice to live in a way that honored who I was, not just as a mother or an ex-wife, but as a woman with her own dreams, her own desires, and her own future. I remembered the day I first told my children about the move. I had expected resistance, expected them to be upset or confused. But surprisingly, their reactions were more thoughtful than I anticipated. My daughter had been the first to understand. "Mom, I get it," she said. "You've always given so much. It's time for you to focus on yourself. I'm happy you're doing this." My son, on the other hand, had been a little more cautious. "Mom, you should be grateful that we live together," he had said, almost as if he was offering some sort of comfort, though it stung more than I expected. I didn't respond immediately. I just smiled, knowing that this was a transition for both of us. His words lingered in my mind for days after, but they were no longer filled with doubt or guilt. They simply reminded me of how far I had come, how much I had given, and how much I had to give to myself now. In the evenings, after my walks and my gardening, I would retreat to the comfort of my favorite chair by the window, a cup of tea in hand, and simply watch the world outside. The solitude didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt empowering. This was my space. I had created it. I had earned it. And as the months passed, I began to understand that the change wasn't just external. It wasn't just about moving into a new house or having a peaceful view of the lake. The real change was within me. I was learning how to live on my own terms, how to embrace the moments of quiet and find peace in them, how to prioritize my own happiness without feeling guilty. I was learning to trust myself again. One evening, I sat in front of the fireplace, a journal in my lap, reflecting on how far I had come. I had spent so many years of my life pouring everything into others, never asking for anything in return. But now, for the first time, I was filling my own cup. And I realized that in doing so, I was giving myself the opportunity to show up as the best version of myself, not just for my family, but for me. This wasn't just a new chapter. It was a new beginning, a chance to rewrite my story. And I was ready to write it. As the weeks went by, I began to feel a sense of peace settle in. The villa, once an empty house full of possibility, was slowly becoming a home. It was a reflection of me, of who I was becoming. Each room felt more personal, more mine. The kitchen, where I spent time cooking simple meals for myself, became a space I cherished, not just because of the meals, but because it was a place where I could be still and centered. The large windows that faced the lake allowed natural light to flood the house, and I often found myself sitting by those windows, gazing out at the water for hours, letting the serenity seep into my soul. There was no rushing anymore. No one demanding my time. No constant tasks to check off. I could breathe, but that didn't mean I wasn't busy. I was building something for myself, slowly, carefully, deliberately. I was learning how to fill my life with things that mattered to me, not to anyone else. And somewhere along the way, I realized that the peace I had longed for wasn't just about the space I had created physically. It was about the space I was creating within myself. One afternoon, as I was sipping tea by the window, I thought back to a conversation I had had with my son months earlier. "Mom, you should be grateful that we live together. Not everyone your age has that privilege," he had said. At the time, I had smiled politely, but his words lingered with me. I had been so wrapped up in living for others that I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself. I didn't need to be grateful for anything other than the fact that I had finally taken control of my own life. I thought about how often we, as women, are expected to put our lives on hold for the sake of others. For our children, our spouses, our families, we give, and somewhere along the way, we forget that we have needs, too. We forget that we deserve happiness, too. The fact that my son had said that to me, while well-meaning, highlighted just how little I had taken for myself over the years. I had spent my whole life giving without asking for anything in return. But now I was beginning to understand that asking for what I needed, wasn't selfish. It was necessary. That night, I took a walk by the lake as the moonlight danced across the water. The stillness was soothing, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude for this new chapter in my life. It wasn't just the villa, it was the opportunity to finally focus on me. To no longer be defined by what I had given to others, but to be defined by what I was choosing to give myself. I stopped by a large tree near the edge of the lake, sat on a bench, and closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the gentle rustling of the leaves. I realized then that I had been living in the shadows for far too long. I had always been the one to shine the light on others, to make sure their lives were full and complete. But in doing so, I had neglected my own light. I had let it dim, waiting for permission to let it shine. But now I was taking that light back. I was finally allowing myself to step into the fullness of who I was without apology. And in that moment, under the quiet, vast sky, I knew that the most important thing I could do from here on out was to continue living for myself. Not out of selfishness, but out of self-respect. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I started setting small goals for myself, not just for the house, but for me. I began painting again, something I hadn't done in years. The canvas became a place where I could express what was in my heart, a place to channel my emotions, my thoughts, and my dreams. I also began to write, jotting down my feelings in a journal each night. For the first time in ages, I wasn't afraid to be honest with myself about what I wanted from life. I also realized that my journey wasn't just about finding peace in solitude. It was about understanding that I deserved to take up space. I deserved to take up time. I deserved to have my voice heard. I had been so focused on making everyone else's life easier that I had forgotten that I had my own voice, my own desires, my own needs. I had to start listening to myself, giving myself permission to live my truth. As I sat at my kitchen table one morning, sipping my coffee, I looked out the window at the lake, and I had a revelation. This was my life now. And it was okay. It was more than okay. It was exactly what I had been waiting for, even if I hadn't known it at the time. I wasn't running away from my past, or from my family. I wasn't rejecting them. I was simply choosing to live in a way that honored who I was, not just who I had been for others. I was embracing this new chapter fully, without hesitation, without guilt, and without fear. The truth was, I had spent so many years living for everyone else that I had forgotten to live for me. But now I was taking back my life. I was stepping into a future that was mine to create, and I wasn't asking for anyone's permission to do it. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift I could give myself. As the days turned into months, my life in the lakeside villa became more than just a new home. It became the space where I was rediscovering who I truly was. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, not as a caretaker or a wife or a mother, but as a woman who had her own needs, desires, and dreams. But with this newfound independence came a realization. I had spent so many years accommodating everyone else, saying yes to everything and putting my own needs aside, that I had forgotten how to set healthy boundaries. The first few months in the villa were transformative, but they weren't without their challenges. I started to realize how much I had allowed myself to be stretched thin over the years, constantly putting my family's needs before my own. My children, despite being grown adults, still expected me to be available for them whenever they needed help, support, or advice. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I didn't have to drop everything for them or for anyone else anymore. I was allowed to say no. Saying no didn't come easily at first. It felt uncomfortable, almost unnatural. I had spent so many years doing everything for others, always making sure they were okay, that the idea of saying no felt selfish. But deep down, I knew I was wrong to feel that way. I wasn't being selfish. I was being responsible. Responsible for my own well-being, for my own peace of mind, for my own happiness. One afternoon, my daughter called. She was going through a difficult time in her personal life, and she needed my advice. She wanted me to drop everything and come over to help her sort through her feelings, as I had always done in the past. Normally, I would have rushed over without thinking twice, but this time, something in me held back. I knew she needed me, but I also knew I needed time for myself. I had been giving so much for so long, and I had to learn how to give to myself first. So I took a deep breath and instead of immediately agreeing, I said, I understand what you're going through, and I want to be there for you. But right now, I need to take care of myself. I can talk to you later, and I'll be here when you need me. But I can't come over right now. There was a pause on the other end of the phone, and for a brief moment, I thought she would protest. But then she said, I get it, Mom. I know you need space, too. Thank you for telling me. That moment was pivotal for me. For the first time, I had put myself first, and the world didn't end. My daughter didn't get upset, and I didn't lose my place in her life. In fact, I realized that by setting a boundary, I was teaching her an important lesson. I was teaching her that it was okay to take a step back, to protect your peace, and to prioritize your own well-being. In the past, I would have felt guilty for not being there immediately, but now I understood that saying no wasn't a rejection, it was an act of self-care. The next test came when my son asked me to help with something, an issue that, in the past, I would have dropped everything for. But this time I paused. I thought about it. I weighed the situation and realized that while I wanted to help, I didn't have to do it all. I didn't have to be the one to solve every problem. So I said, I'm happy to help, but I'm going to need some space to focus on my own things too. Let's figure out a time that works for both of us. It wasn't easy, but once I made the decision, I felt a sense of relief. I wasn't saying no to them. I was saying yes to myself, and that made all the difference. As the months went by, I began to see the positive effects of setting boundaries. I was able to take on less, but I was present in the things I did. I wasn't spread too thin anymore. My relationships with my children began to change, too. They started to see me in a new light, not just as the person who was always available for them, but as a person with her own life, her own needs. And while that was difficult for them at first, it ultimately strengthened our bond. I wasn't just their mother, I was a woman with a voice, with desires, with boundaries. One day, I sat down in front of my journal, reflecting on how far I had come. The woman who had once been overwhelmed by the constant needs of others was now a woman who could stand firm in her own space. I had learned how to say no without guilt. I had learned how to protect my energy and to prioritize my peace. And in doing so, I had found a deeper connection with my family, not because I gave more of myself, but because I had given myself the permission to be whole. Setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting my time. It was about protecting my heart. It was about understanding that I am worthy of respect, of love, and of time. And in teaching my family how to respect my boundaries, I was teaching them how to respect themselves, too. The more I set boundaries, the more I realized that this was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was a declaration that I was not just a caretaker, not just a mother or wife, but a person in my own right, deserving of my own time, my own space, and my own love. It's funny how the smallest shifts in perspective can completely change the way we see the world. The more I settled into my new life at the lakeside villa, the more I started to understand how deeply my mindset had been shaped by years of living for others. The boundaries I had set weren't just about saying no to others. They were about learning to say yes to myself, to my needs, and to the life I had always dreamed of living, but never thought I could have. At first, it felt a little uncomfortable. I had spent so many years being the person who took care of everyone else that, at times, I felt almost guilty for focusing on myself. But slowly, that guilt started to fade. And in its place, I found something I hadn't realized I'd been missing, an unshakable sense of peace and freedom. I started to see my life from a different angle. The quiet mornings by the lake, the hours spent painting and writing, the long walks that clear my mind, they weren't just ways to fill the time. They were opportunities to reconnect with myself. And in doing so, I began to realize something profound. I wasn't missing out on anything by focusing on myself. I wasn't being selfish. I was simply becoming whole again. As I started embracing this new way of living, something unexpected began to happen. My relationships with my children started to evolve. The tension that had once existed between us, this unspoken expectation that I should always be available, always be the one to drop everything for them, began to lift. They started to see me differently, not as someone who existed solely for their benefit, but as a person with my own life, my own desires. I remember one conversation with my daughter. She had come over to visit me one afternoon, and we were sitting outside, enjoying the breeze. I could tell she was still adjusting to the changes in our dynamic, but she was trying to understand. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "I know you needed this space, and I'm glad you're doing this for yourself. I just want you to know that I see you. I see you as more than just my mom. I see you as you." Those words struck me deeply. For so long, I had been defined by my role as a mother, as the one who was always there, always sacrificing. But now, for the first time, my daughter was seeing me as a woman, as an individual with a life of her own. And it felt incredibly liberating. As my children began to adjust to the changes, I realized that this wasn't just about me finding peace. It was about creating a new kind of relationship with them. One where I wasn't just fulfilling their needs, but where we were both seeing each other as equals, where I could express my boundaries and they could learn to respect them, not because I demanded it, but because I had taught them through my actions that I was worthy of respect. This shift in perspective didn't just change my relationships with my children, it changed the way I saw the world. I realized that I had spent so much of my life in service to others that I had forgotten how to live for myself. I had been waiting for the world to give me permission to take a step back, to live in a way that honored my own needs. But now, I understood that I didn't need anyone's permission. I had the right to choose how I wanted to live, and that was powerful. I started to think about all the dreams I had put aside for years, the trips I wanted to take, the places I wanted to see, the experiences I had always dreamed of, but never prioritized. I thought about how I had put off so many things, waiting for the right time, waiting for the approval of others. But now, I realized that the right time was now. There was no need to wait for anyone's approval. The only person I needed to answer to was myself. With that newfound clarity, I began planning trips for myself, small getaways to explore new places, to meet new people, and to experience life outside the small bubble I had been living in for so long. I started taking classes, learning new skills, and even getting involved in local community events. These weren't just things to fill the time. They were opportunities for me to rediscover who I was, to step into new parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I began to travel more, just for the joy of it. I went to small coastal towns, visited museums, took long drives through the countryside. Each trip, each experience was an act of reclaiming my life. I realized that I didn't need to wait for permission to enjoy my life. I didn't need to wait for a special occasion. The time to live fully was now. And in doing so, I began to see the world through a different lens. I wasn't just living for others anymore. I wasn't waiting for life to happen to me. I was actively creating the life I wanted, and it felt like I was finally living in alignment with my true self. The change wasn't just internal, it was external too. I started to look at my future with a sense of excitement, not fear. I had built a life that was centered around me, a life that allowed me to embrace change, to explore new opportunities, and to keep growing. The woman who had once been defined by her role as a mother, as a wife, was now living as a woman who was free to follow her own path, no matter where it might lead. Letting go is one of the hardest things we can do, especially when it feels like we're leaving behind parts of our lives that we've worked so hard to build. I had spent years being the one who held everything together. My marriage, my family, my home. I had made sacrifices, put everyone else's needs ahead of my own, and believed that my worth was defined by how much I could give. But now, as I sat in my lakeside villa, watching the world change outside my window, I realized that letting go was not just an act of releasing, it was an act of freedom. I had spent so much of my life holding on to things that no longer served me. My role as a wife, the expectations of being a perfect mother, the need to constantly prove my value through service and sacrifice. These things had become burdens. I had been carrying them for so long that I didn't even realize the weight until I finally stopped and allowed myself to breathe. The hardest part of letting go was releasing the idea of who I thought I should be. I had always believed that I needed to be the perfect mother, the one who was always there, always ready to fix things, always giving without asking for anything in return. But as I sat in the stillness of my new life, I realized that perfection was an illusion. There was no such thing as a perfect mother, a perfect wife, or a perfect woman. And trying to live up to that ideal had kept me from being the woman I truly was. I had to let go of the guilt that had been ingrained in me for so many years, the guilt of not being enough, of not doing enough. I had to let go of the belief that my worth was tied to how much I could give to others. That was a difficult pill to swallow, because for so long, I had believed that giving everything was the only way to be loved and valued. But as I sat in my new space, I realized that love doesn't require sacrifice at the expense of yourself. True love, real love, starts with loving yourself first. The next step was letting go of the idea that I had to be the same person I was before. The person who constantly put others first, who was always busy and always available, who wore the role of caretaker like a badge of honor. That person was not who I was anymore. And letting go of her, letting go of that image of myself, was the hardest thing I had to do. It meant accepting that I didn't have to keep fulfilling everyone else's expectations of me. I didn't have to be the fixer, the giver, the one who always sacrificed. But letting go wasn't just about releasing old roles and expectations. It was about embracing something new, something that was mine. It was about releasing the fear of change and accepting the unknown. I had spent so much of my life avoiding change, afraid of what would happen if I stepped out of the boxes that had been created for me. But now I understood that change wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. It was the very thing that allowed me to transform my life. Letting go also meant accepting that my relationship with my children had to evolve. As much as I loved them, as much as I would always be their mother, I had to let go of the idea that I needed to be everything for them. They were adults now, and it was time for them to live their own lives. I wasn't abandoning them. I was giving them the space to grow, just as I was learning to grow. I had to let go of the belief that I had to fix everything for them, that I had to be the one to solve their problems. They needed to learn how to solve their own problems, just as I had to learn how to live my life without always putting theirs first. That realization didn't come easily, and there were moments when I felt the pang of guilt. When my son called, asking for help with something that I knew he could figure out on his own, I felt the old pull, the desire to rush in, to offer my help, to make everything easier for him. But I took a deep breath and reminded myself of the lesson I was learning. I didn't have to do everything. I didn't have to be everything to everyone. I could say no without guilt. I could step back and allow him to find his own way. And in doing so, I was teaching him the same lesson I was learning: how to live independently, how to find strength within yourself, how to step into your own power. Letting go also meant accepting that I was no longer the person I had once been. I had spent years defining myself by what I did for others, by the roles I played. But now I was learning to define myself by who I was, by what I wanted, by what brought me joy. And that meant I had to let go of the idea that I had to fit into anyone else's mold. I was no longer bound by the roles I had created for myself. I was free to be who I truly was. Letting go was the most freeing thing I had ever done. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always comfortable. There were days when the weight of the past would come crashing back, when I would wonder if I had made the right choice. But as time went on, I realized that letting go wasn't about losing something. It was about gaining everything. It was about creating space for new opportunities, for new ways of thinking, for a life that was truly mine. And as I sat on the porch of my villa one evening, watching the sun set over the lake, I understood something profoundly important. Letting go wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of strength. It was about trusting myself enough to know that I didn't need to hold onto the past. I didn't need to keep trying to control everything. I just needed to let go and trust that life would unfold exactly as it was meant to. The journey to reclaiming my life wasn't an easy one. In fact, it was full of unexpected turns, painful lessons, and moments of doubt. But as I sat back one evening on the porch of my lakeside villa, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, I realized how far I had come. The lessons I had learned over the past months were invaluable, and they had shaped me into a woman who no longer defined herself by her sacrifices, but by her strength, her choices, and her newfound sense of independence. The first lesson I learned was the importance of self-worth. For so many years, I had measured my value by how much I could give to others. My worth was tied to how much I could do for my children, for my ex-husband, for the people in my life. I thought that if I gave enough, if I sacrificed enough, I would be loved and appreciated in return. But now, I understood that true worth comes from within. I didn't need to constantly prove myself to anyone. I didn't need anyone's validation to know that I was worthy of love, happiness, and respect. I was enough just as I was. The second lesson I learned was the power of boundaries. For years, I had said yes to everything. I had been the one to take on everyone's problems, to fix everything, to make sure everyone else was okay, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace. But setting boundaries was a game changer. I learned to say no when I needed to, and in doing so, I started to protect my own time, energy, and emotions. Setting boundaries wasn't about shutting people out or being selfish. It was about self-respect. It was about acknowledging that my needs were just as important as anyone else's, and that it was okay to take a step back and focus on myself. I also learned that letting go was not just about releasing people or situations. It was about releasing old beliefs and habits that no longer serve me. I had spent so much of my life trying to be everything to everyone, trying to meet impossible standards, and I had let those expectations define me. Letting go of those old patterns was the most liberating thing I could do for myself. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I wanted to fall back into the old habits of being the constant giver, the one who was always there for everyone, but I had learned that true freedom comes from being able to release the things that weigh you down. I also learned that self-care isn't selfish. For years, I thought that putting others first was the right thing to do. I thought that my happiness was tied to how much I could do for my family. But as I settled into my new life, I realized that self-care wasn't just about pampering myself or taking breaks. It was about prioritizing my well-being, mentally, emotionally, and physically. It was about creating a life where I didn't just survive, but thrived. I learned that taking care of myself didn't make me a bad mother or a bad person. It made me a better version of myself. When I was happy and at peace, I could show up for the people I loved in a way that was healthy and sustainable. Another important lesson was the power of change. Change had always scared me. I had spent so many years clinging to the familiar, to the roles I had always known. But change, I realized, was the only way to grow. It wasn't about running away from my past. It was about embracing the future and the possibilities it held. The change I had made in my life, from moving to the villa to redefining my relationships, was the most empowering decision I had ever made. It taught me that it's never too late to reinvent yourself, to start over, to choose a different path. And then, perhaps the most important lesson of all, I am allowed to take up space. For years, I had lived in the background, putting everyone else's needs ahead of my own. I had quietly assumed that my role was to give and to serve, to always be the one in the background, making sure everything was taken care of. But now, I understood that I was just as important as anyone else. My voice, my needs, my dreams, all of them mattered. I didn't have to shrink myself to make others comfortable. I could take up space in this world, and that was okay. I could have a life that was mine, and I could live it unapologetically. As I reflected on everything I had learned, I realized that these lessons weren't just about making changes to my life. They were about making changes to the way I viewed myself. I wasn't just a mother, a wife, an ex-wife, or a caretaker. I was a woman with my own needs, desires, and dreams. And the most important thing I had learned through all of this was that I had the right to live for me. In the past, I had always defined myself by the roles I played for others. But now, I understood that I was not just those roles. I was a person in my own right. And that understanding, that realization, had changed everything. The lessons I had learned were not easy ones, but they were worth it. I had spent so many years putting others first, neglecting my own needs, that I had lost sight of who I was. But now I was reclaiming myself. I was rediscovering my passions, my joy, my peace. I was learning how to be the best version of myself. Not just for my family, but for me. And as I sat there reflecting on the journey I had made, I knew that the road ahead was full of possibilities. I had spent so many years waiting for permission to live for myself. But now, I didn't need anyone's permission. I had already given myself the approval I needed. I was ready to embrace the life I had always wanted, and I was ready to step into the future with confidence, peace, and the strength that came from knowing my own worth. As the months passed and the villa became more than just a house, I found myself settling into a rhythm I hadn't known I was capable of. It wasn't just about the space I had created, it was about the life I was beginning to live in that space. A life I had once been too afraid to embrace. It was a life built on the foundation of everything I had learned: self-worth, boundaries, self-care, and the courage to change. The woman who had once been consumed by the needs of others was now a woman living for herself, unapologetically and fully. The quiet mornings by the lake had become my sanctuary. I woke up early every day, before the world stirred, and took a moment to enjoy the calm before the sun rose over the water. There was something deeply grounding about that time. Just me, the rising sun, and the peaceful sounds of nature. It was a reminder that, for the first time, I was giving myself the space to simply be. The shift within me had rippled outward. I had grown stronger in my relationships with my children, despite the challenges that arose when I began to prioritize myself. They were still adjusting to the changes, and so was I. I knew that learning to respect my boundaries was a process, not just for me, but for them as well. But something had changed in our dynamic. Instead of feeling like I was constantly being pulled in every direction, I found myself more present, more connected. The love we shared was still there, but it wasn't dependent on my constant sacrifices. It was more balanced, more mutual. And that was what I had longed for. One evening, as I sat at the dining table with my son, we had an unexpected conversation. He looked at me for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "Mom," he said quietly, "I see the change in you. I see you doing things for yourself now. I think it's good for you. But sometimes, I worry you're too far away, that you're not as present as you used to be." His words surprised me. For a moment, I wasn't sure how to respond. There was a part of me that still felt the weight of guilt, even though I knew deep down that I wasn't doing anything wrong. But instead of getting defensive, I listened. I realized that his concern was rooted in love, in a desire to stay connected. I smiled gently and said, "I'm still here. I'm just learning to take care of myself, too. It doesn't mean I love you any less. I'm still your mother, but I'm also me. And I think that's something we both need to understand." He looked at me for a long time before nodding, a small, understanding smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I get it, Mom. I really do." That moment of mutual understanding meant more to me than I could put into words. It was a realization that I was not just changing on the inside. I was reshaping my entire life. And in doing so, I was teaching my children the value of self-love and respect. It was a lesson I wished I had learned much earlier, but I was grateful to be teaching it now, at this stage in my life. But my journey wasn't just about my relationships with others. It was about the relationship I was rebuilding with myself. As I stood in front of the mirror one morning, brushing my hair, I caught a glimpse of the woman who had emerged from the quiet, from the challenges, and from the years of self-doubt. She wasn't the same woman I had been before. She was stronger, more confident, more sure of her worth. She was not defined by what others needed her to be, but by who she had chosen to become. I started to dream again. I thought about the places I wanted to travel, the experiences I wanted to have, and the things I had put aside for so long. I wasn't just existing anymore. I was living. And the thought of the future, once filled with uncertainty, now felt like an open road, full of endless possibilities. I even began to take up new hobbies, something I had never had time for before. I started playing the piano again, something I had loved as a child, but had abandoned over the years. I also began to volunteer at a local community center, helping out with projects that brought me joy and fulfillment. These were not just distractions, they were a reflection of a life that was mine. I was doing things that I enjoyed, not because someone else expected it, but because I wanted to. My life was still far from perfect. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had made the right choices, if I had done enough for my children. There were still moments when I missed the family I had once known, when the quiet of the villa felt overwhelming. But those moments became fewer and farther between. I had learned to trust myself, and that trust carried me through the difficult times. I knew that I had made the right decision to live for myself, to embrace the quiet, and to step into a life that was truly mine. The future was no longer something I feared. It was something I looked forward to with excitement. There were still challenges ahead, no doubt. But I had learned how to navigate them with grace, to embrace change with open arms, and to trust that I was capable of handling whatever came my way. The woman I had become was someone who didn't need anyone's permission to live her truth. I had found my voice, my power, and my sense of self. And as I watched the sun set over the lake that evening, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally living a life that was mine, and that was everything. As I sat on the porch of my lakeside villa, watching the last rays of the setting sun cast a golden glow over the water, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey I had been on. It wasn't just about moving into a new house or adjusting to life alone. It was about reclaiming my life, my voice, my worth, and my peace. It was about finally learning that I deserved to live for me. The changes had been gradual, almost imperceptible at times. But now, looking back, I realized how much I had transformed. The woman who had once felt invisible, who had been defined by the needs of others, was no longer the person I saw in the mirror. The woman who had always given without asking for anything in return, who had forgotten how to put herself first, had rediscovered herself. And in doing so, she had found freedom. I had learned to set boundaries, to say no without guilt, to prioritize my happiness without feeling selfish. I had learned that it was okay to take up space in this world, to live for myself, to embrace the quiet and the solitude, and to fill my life with things that truly mattered to me. And in doing so, I had created a life that was mine, not just as a mother or a wife, but as a woman with dreams, passions, and desires of her own. I remembered the moment when I had moved into the villa. It had felt like an act of defiance at first, like a bold decision to step away from everything I had known. But now, it felt like the best decision I had ever made. I had given myself permission to build a life on my own terms. I had freed myself from the weight of old expectations, from the fear of not being enough, from the need to be everything for everyone. Of course, it hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, moments when I missed my children, when the quiet felt too loud, when I questioned whether I had done the right thing. But those moments were fleeting. With each passing day, I grew stronger, more confident in my choices. I had learned to trust myself, to believe that I was worthy of the life I had chosen, and to accept that change was not something to fear, but something to embrace. The relationship I had with my children had changed too. They had seen me struggle. They had seen me give everything. And now they were seeing me take back control of my life. There were still moments of tension, times when they didn't fully understand my choices, times when they wished I were more present in their lives. But I had learned to set boundaries, to protect my peace, and to show them that I was still here, still their mother, but also a woman with a life of her own. And as I looked out over the lake that evening, I realized that the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was filled with possibility. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but I knew that I was ready for whatever came my way. I had learned to trust that everything would unfold as it was meant to, and that I had the strength to handle it. I had found my voice, my power, and my sense of self. I had created a life that was my own, one that reflected my true desires, my true needs. I was no longer waiting for permission to live fully. I was living on my own terms, and that was the greatest gift I could give myself. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I smiled to myself. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in my life, I felt ready. Ready to embrace every new chapter, every new opportunity, every new challenge. Because I knew now more than ever that I was capable. I was enough, and I was finally living the life I had always deserved.